Very special thanks once again to Cardiff Trade Sales for providing, of course, the vehicle in this review. If you're on the lookout for a car like this one, or maybe some of the other vehicles that I've reviewed from them as well, or something more on the affordable end of the daily driver spectrum even, then of course click the link down in the description to check out their current stock. When it comes to this specific trim of Mercedes SL, being as it is the R231 generation, and even more specifically the facelifted version of that generation from 2016 onwards, this car to me has an interesting predicament which it presents you as a potential buyer or driver in. Or me, in this case, when I was driving the car. And that is that both this car's strongest and I would argue weakest points are funnily enough the same thing. And that thing is an absence of three little letters. AMG. This is not a Mercedes SL AMG. It's not a 55, 63, 65, certainly not a black series, but that could, of course, be a downside for many people for fairly obvious reasons, but I believe it could actually be an upside, an advantage even in some ways. So let's get into why, and I'm going to talk about both sides of the argument, both the positives and the negatives. Now, in terms of the potential negatives, they're fairly obvious. The Mercedes SL has pretty much always been the flagship Mercedes sports car. You've got SLKs, SLCs, even coupes, for instance, like the CLK or the E-Class coupe, but this is really where it's at. This is the flagship Mercedes sports car all the way back to the 50s with the Gullwing. This is a very important car as well for Mercedes because it really represents a culmination of everything that all of their other cars have, in effect, put into one. It's a sports car, so it has that side of the spectrum, but it's also a larger, more comfortable, even in some cases fairly spacious approach of a car, which caters to the luxury side of Mercedes. It's not all about one or the other. It's not just a performance car, it's not just a luxury car, it's both. That means that Mercedes really has a chance to put their prowess on show. And when it comes to something like an AMG version, well, of course it's easy to find stuff to love. The 55 has that great supercharged V8 engine, the 65 of course has that monstrous V12, especially in the R230 generation, which preceded this car, legendary modern Mercedes already, and of course you've got crazy ones like the Black Series, which for obvious reasons have a lot of fans. Stuff like this though can easily be overlooked, and the reason why is down to a theory which I have, and that is the numbers game. See, anything down to an SL400 and it still seems like a pretty cool sports car. Once you go below the number 500 though, there's something which seems to happen for a lot of people where they immediately lose quite a lot of interest, and I can fairly simply highlight that fact by just creating a scenario in your mind. If somebody were to ask you, would you rather have a Mercedes SL600 or an SL55 AMG, what would you say? Well, the vast majority of petrol heads, unless you know your Mercs pretty well, would probably go for the AMG. People have that recognition of the AMG moniker, 55, 63, 65, it just sounds cool, and they're known to be good. These brutish, over-the-top, overpowered torque monsters. In effect, German muscle. The reality is though that the SL600 actually has a larger, more powerful, more impressive engine, and is borderline an SL65 in undercover clothes. That's kind of the point of the SL600. That highlights my point though. Just because something doesn't have an AMG badge doesn't mean it's not very good. And in the case of this car, even though I will freely admit that when I first got into it and heard, SL400, let's see what this car is like, I wasn't particularly stoked to see how good it was. I knew it would have certain things going for it. It's a Merc, so it was going to be well made and probably very comfortable, and it would probably attract a lot of attention because the SL is known for being a really good looking car, with something that I mentioned in my last review for the BMW 640D, and that is a ton of road presence. It's a very elegant, imposing looking car in pretty much all of its forms, especially through the 2000s. The car does tick all of those boxes, but the parts which surprised me were the things which you would never see in an AMG of this version, and that starts with the engine. The engine in this car is a V6. That sounds immediately underwhelming for an SL, but bear with me, because as you can hear throughout this video and even at the start, that V6 has a very nice sound to it. In fact, it sounds a lot more impressive than I would have thought Mercedes would make it. Merc, you could easily say, would have an understated approach to the sound, but they didn't. They chose to highlight the noise of the engine and make it sound great. It's only a 3 litre, but it's a bi-turbo V6, so the numbers are actually really good. 362 horsepower, 369 pound-feet of torque, and of course it's nothing new for a Mercedes SL to have more torque than power. In fact, a lot of the top AMGs carry that over as well, especially those V12s. Now in the case of performance, no, it's not an AMG, but it sure ain't slow. Of course it's limited to 155 as you'd expect, but the 0 to 60 is 4.9 seconds. It's of course rear-wheel drive, it has a very nice gearbox, super smooth, 9-speed automatic, with paddles as you'd assume, and it just feels lovely to drive. Everything about the car can pretty much be summed up by that one word. It's lovely. It's not necessarily exciting, or visceral, or brutish, or a lot of these other words that I could describe a number of performance cars that I've driven before as, but it's also not trying to be. And that brings me to the positive side of not being an AMG. See, this car not being a 55, 63, 65, etc. actually takes a lot of that, in effect, weight off of its shoulders. Because people's expectations aren't as high, you can actually kind of be surprised in this sneaky sort of way, and I certainly was when I drove this car, in a similar way to another Mercedes non-AMG which I reviewed a long time ago on the channel now, the SL400. Big flagship coupe at the time, no AMG badge, but a really impressive car, and very similar to this in terms of not only how it feels and how it drives, but very much so in terms of the kind of buyer who I think would really like it. See, this is categorically not a car for somebody who wants to floor it everywhere, have visceral fun, throw the tail out through corners and have, track days every other weekend. It's just not that kind of car. The SL400 wasn't either, and it's not about how much power you have, it's not about the torque, it's not about the 0 to 60, it's just about the way the car presents itself. There are entirely different ways of delivering performance, as many of you who drive will know, especially those of you who have driven or even owned performance cars. You can have a car with huge amounts of power, which feels so much less involved than some little hot hatch with, say, 100 or 200 horses to work with that feels incredible, because it's all about how the car delivers that performance and how it uses it. This is a very capable car in a straight line. 4.9 is on par with stuff like Jag XKRs in its 4.2 supercharged V8 form, and of course that car is older, but it's still a pretty worthy comparison to make. And even in terms of fuel economy, this brings me as well to something which, yes, some people might not care as much about in a sports car, but for me I certainly do. In my opinion, if you can have a car that's great looking and fast and powerful, but which also has good economy, well, that's really something to be impressed by and almost to boast about, because any car can use a ton of fuel. It takes great engineering to not use as much fuel and still get great results. And that's exactly what this car does, because this car can do in the city about 27 miles per gallon. That sounds probably what you'd expect, but on the highway it goes all the way up to 47, and even combined this can do 37 miles per gallon. Now that highway economy is not anywhere near what I would expect from a 3-litre twin-turbo V6 petrol in a car which weighs about 1,700 kilos. That is a pretty hefty car, and also not surprising for an SL. But on the point of weight, that's actually one of the biggest improvements that Mercedes made to this car compared to even the car which it replaced, the R230, because this is the first time they fitted it with an aluminium body, and that saved a massive amount of weight. See, it's not uncommon for something like a previous generation, for instance SL600, to weigh around 2.1 tons. Almost, Bentley territory. This weighs 1,735. That is a whole lot less. Now that's still a little bit more than, for instance, a Jag, but that's not bad. The Mercedes SL was traditionally one of the heaviest convertibles you can buy, and now it's actually much more impressive and closer, in fact better in some cases, than a lot of the competition. That's one of the reasons why the performance is so good for what is an impressive but not remarkable amount of power and torque. that it's got to work with. Now, in terms of how it feels and how it drives, handling, driving manners, etc., as I said, it's not a hoonmobile. You're not going to be fishtailing this thing everywhere like a TVR. It's not designed for that. This is a car which is designed to, in effect, waft across continents in complete comfort, with very nice sounds, great power when you want to use it, and more than all else, a smooth, elegant experience. And that, in a nutshell, is really what separates it from the AMGs, because for the most part, they are categorically not designed to do that. They are designed to be over the top, louder, more raw, certainly more powerful with way more torque, and they are known for being tire eaters. They are, as I said earlier on, German muscle cars. This is not. It's a totally different driving experience, and much like the praise which I gave the Porsche 911, having a great base of a sports car is really a great idea, because it allows you to have something which is like this, much more sophisticated, calmer, powerful, but not necessarily overly exciting, more of a super cruiser in effect. But then that same platform of car, the SL, can go all the way up to the other end and have a crazy overpowered AMG and a black edition in some cases, etc., all based on the same underlying car. That to me proves that it is a good vehicle. In this form, the real key about it not being an AMG means that yes, a lot of people won't pay attention to it, but that can also help bargain prices. Because of course AMGs are going to keep their value. Even some older AMGs are still worth more than the competition from 10, 15, 20 years ago, sometimes even more. Whereas a car like this, something like an SL400, an SL350, well, they just don't keep AMG values. But that means that on the used market, even for something like this one, which is significantly newer, the value for money and the amount of car that you get for the price is actually pretty good. This car, for instance, is only from 2016. It's already £31,000 in this case, and that's a lot of car for the money. Now, of course, you could go older and get something even cheaper, even another SL, for example, but you also benefit from the newer tech. So, for instance, that drastically improved fuel economy, much better weight to be working with, newer style inside and out, and the interior is admittedly a very nice place to be. Of course, the panoramic roof with the option of taking the roof down, as pretty much all SLs have got to have unless it's a black series. It's everything you would want a car like this to be. If you want an AMG, well, of course you're going to buy one. But if you're the kind of person who maybe doesn't want something that extreme, well, this is a very nice alternative. All SLs are continent crushers. It just depends on how you want to crush the continent. Do you want to tear the continent in half with the sheer torque of an AMG engine, or do you want to waft across it like a borderline two-seater Rolls-Royce? In that regard, I think this car does what it sets out to do really well. It's not the most exciting thing around, but it's a lovely experience, a very, very well engineered one, and just an impressive car in every way. It looks good, it's classy, it's certainly elegant, and no matter the age, SLs still attract a huge amount of attention on the road. It offers a lot of what something like a Jag or an Aston or even a Porsche would offer in terms of sheer road presence, but with, in some cases, better fuel economy, better reliability, more in-depth engineering, etc. So if that's the kind of car that appeals to you, then certainly check out one of these. Not necessarily just an SL400, but of course this being the perfect example that I drove here. Overall though, that's it for this review. Of course I've done plenty of other Mercedes reviews on the channel, including some AMGs, so of course click here on screen to see those. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.